Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Professor Barlow Mugrdechian of the Armenian Studies program, and I'd like to welcome you to our international conference on the state of the art of the early Turkish Republic period and its historiography, sources, and future directions. I want to thank the Society for Armenian Studies for co-sponsoring this conference. This conference is organized by my colleague, Dr. Ümit Kurt, who is a Polonsky Fellow at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, and I organized it together with him. I also would like to thank our sponsors, the Armenian Studies Program of Fresno State, but with the support of the Leon S. Peters Foundation and the M. Victoria Kazan Fund. What I'd like to do before we begin the conference is always to kind of give our audience some of the upcoming events in the Armenian Studies program. So I have a very brief PowerPoint I'd like to share with everyone where you'll be able to see some of our upcoming events. When we come back from that, we'll start with our conference. Sorry about that. Let me restart that. So those are a few of our upcoming events. We have quite a few events coming up. And if you're interested, always you can go to our website or also to our Facebook page, which gives all of our upcoming events. This conference, called again, The State of the Art of the Early Turkish Republic Period, is going to be organized in two sessions. The first session will be this evening, and we'll have 3 speakers, followed by a question and answer period. So if you have questions and answers, please use the question and answer function of Zoom. It should be at the bottom of your screen, and you can use that to ask questions at any time. And at the end, I'll collect the questions and ask our participants to respond to the questions. And then tomorrow morning on Saturday, October the 3rd, beginning at 10 o'clock in California, we will have 3 more speakers, Dr. Talin Sujian, Dr. Ümit Kurt, and Dr. Ari Sheklian, who will also present their interpretations of the topic that we're going to be talking about. What we're going to be doing today is to talk about the historical context of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of a new nation state, the Republic of Turkey. And the aim of the conference was to bring together scholars to explore some of these new facets, to discuss and to analyze the major issues that played a dominant role in the history of this period. And that includes things like the emergence of modern state, the impact of war, nationalism, and nation building, and the role of religion and secularism. So I'm very happy that we're having this conference. The hope is that after the conference that our participants will contribute their papers to form a book. So we like to now publish books based on conferences held at the Armenian Studies program. So I'd like to begin by introducing our first guest speaker. She is Dr. Christine Philliou. She's an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of California, Berkeley, and she specializes in Ottoman and modern Turkish and Greek history. Her first book, Biography of an Empire Governing Ottomans in an Age of Revolution, was published in 2011, examined the crisis and transformation in Ottoman governance in the first half of the 19th century, and on the eve of the Tanzimat reforms through the lens of Fanariots, a Greek-identified Orthodox Christian group of Ottoman functionaries. Her forthcoming book, which will be published early next year, called Turkey, A Past Against History, turns to the final year of the Ottoman Empire and the transition to the Turkish Republic through the concept of muhalefet, or internal opposition and dissent. In looking at one Ottoman Turkish writer who opposed the CUP, the Turkish National Movement, and the early Republican state, the book explores the fissures within the category of Turk, and in doing so considers the place of the Armenian genocide, the policies that facilitated it, the reactions among intellectuals at the time, and the way dissident Turks might have articulated a different understanding of it after the fact in this landscape of opposition and dissent. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Christine Philliou.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to begin by thanking Ümit and Barlow for inviting me to give this address and to say what an honor it is, and really how much I'm looking forward to the papers and the discussion. There's an overwhelming number of problems swirling around us right now in the world, and I have to say it's a welcome break to focus on scholarship and history together for a few moments. And we are at, likewise, a crucial juncture in the field of Ottoman and modern Turkish history. And it seems to me from afar, the field of Armenian history. So it's also a privilege to be able to think together about that this evening and tomorrow. In fact, what I'd like to prove to you or argue this evening is related to that and is simple. And really the papers that follow in this conference are the best proof of this, that there has never been a more exciting or complicated time to be a historian of Turkey, and in particular of the Turkish early Republican period. A case in point is the Armenian Studies program at Fresno that has organized this conference on the early Republican period of Turkish history and has invited me, a historian who does not work on Armenian history per se. And while my forthcoming work implicates the early Republican period, I've worked on Greek history in the past to give this keynote. So I'd like to explain in the broader sense of how knowledge has been and is being produced about the early Republic, how this turn of events could come about and how we got to where we are and why it makes perfect sense given the state of the art of the early Turkish Republic. So first, let's just stake out the formal parameters of the early Turkish Republic. Okay, October 1923, when the independent state of Turkey was declared a republic, until roughly 1928, when the process of consolidation of political authority of Mustafa Kemal over the Republican People's Party and the one-party republic was completed. When we look at it through this lens, it seems like a cut and dry topic. Although we know that we cannot discuss the Republic between 1923 and 1928 without considering the War of Independence / Armistice period, the World War, and the genocide, and so much else. For our purposes, let's just stick for the moment to the narrow definition of the early Republican period, 23 to 28. And even just sticking in that, we can see from the papers that follow that that 5-year period is so complex that it warrants really a whole subfield, which is what's happening before our eyes these days. Let's just pretend that we were naive historians for a moment, and someone puts before us this problem of the half decade that was the early Republic, and that we're unaware of the politics that plague the field in the past and today. And our task would be just to take apart these 5 years and offer a cascade of questions that would spring to the mind for historians thinking about any new state formation. These questions would be just like operating from a generic historian's mind. Who built this new state? According to which ideals, and working within which realities? When we say who, we would mean that in terms of individuals, the leaders, the administrators, the military men, the civilians who made up the new citizenry, and in terms of collections of individuals, parties, organizations, institutions. We might ask, what were the boundaries of belonging and exclusion to the state and to the nation at large, and where did those boundaries come from? What were the political conflicts that went on in this formative period for the Republican state? How were they resolved or not by the end of the period? Was the decision to form a republic influenced by contemporaneous developments in neighboring states, such as maybe the case, as was the case in the formation of the Soviet Union as a union of republics less than a year prior? What were the many orders of connections to the recent Ottoman past, and particularly to Ottoman constitutionalism, given that Turkey was the rump state of the empire and inherited so much of its geography, population, and institutions from the empire? What role did the intelligentsia play, if there was such a unified class, in these first 5 years? Did they challenge the new authority in Ankara? Did they join forces with it? When, if they did? Which members of the intelligentsia chose which path and why? What difference did that make to the formation of the Republic by 1928 and beyond? To what extent was the principle of secularism driving events? And to what extent was it the solution or the outcome of the processes that were driving the events? Now, of course, all of these questions assume that we've separated off the early Republic from all that came before, not just the Ottoman Empire in the generic sense, but World War I, the genocide, the CUP, the Eastern Question, the capitulations, the League of Nations, and so much else, as well as what would come after the Kemalist one-party republic, the institutionalization of Kemalist knowledge and identity, including the merging together of party, nation, and state that would happen in the 1930s. And from the ramifications of that merging together of party, nation, and state beyond, through the formal transition to a multi-party system, and then a multi-party system guarded by the Turkish military and beyond. So historians would want to basically know the nuts and bolts of state formation, as they would in any state in formation, right? And they'd want to know, how is it unique in the case of Turkey? And they would focus on the crucial first 5 years of the Republic to glean the insights on that process, right? And the description of the present conference conveys this very well, right? The ways that the early Republic is both a product of that which came before and the foundation for that which would come after, right? It's all very intuitive and makes perfect sense. And the significance is clear. So what's surprising about all of this? The surprising thing when one looks at it is how recently the early Republican period has been held under real scholarly scrutiny. It is pretty amazing, I have to say. It is amazing that it's almost 100 years have passed since the establishment of the Turkish Republic. And we really have only the most general outlines of the answers to these questions that I've just put forward. Consider for comparison the kinds of debates, controversies, revisions, and counter-revisions that have been made regarding the contemporaneous Russian Revolution and early Soviet period. If a historian were to grade the field of early Republican history in this light, it would barely get a passing mark. So I think many of us know why this is, but it's of course because there has been a whole series of barriers that are far bigger than us or our capacities as individual scholars. In fact, considering the history of these barriers is the preliminary task to getting down to the core questions that I touched on above, right? Which would then get us to the question of the formation and nature of power in the early Republic and beyond. And then, of course, how that shaped the subsequent periods, right? So let's just pause for a moment and take these barriers, right? So the barriers and then these schools or the revisionist turns that have started to move us beyond those barriers in order to get to the state of the art where we are now. The major barrier to a critical understanding of the events themselves, right? If we just imagine that for a moment as like ground zero, the actual events between 1923 and 1928, and of the questions that we've generated around those events. Nutuk, right? I think we're all familiar with this text. But for those that are not, Nutuk, meaning speech or the great speech, was the epic speech delivered by Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, over the course of several days in October 1927 to the Second Party Congress of the Republican People's Party, the party which had been founded in September 1923, a month before the establishment of the Republic itself. If there can be said to have been a be-all and end-all of the Kemalist Republic, besides Mustafa Kemal Ataturk himself, it might be Nutuk. It might have been Nutuk itself. This speech is so defining for a number of reasons and complicates, it has severely complicated and really crippled our mission as historians for a long time. So why? It is a history, right? More properly, it is the master narrative of the formation of the Turkish national movement and then of the formation of the Republic. It is also a kind of memoir told in the first person by Mustafa Kemal, the leader and the father of the nation, founder of the state, of the single party, and the first president of the Republic. It is still, even after a decade or two of Kemalism being under siege, the national meta-narrative. It created and justified the sovereign existence of a Turkish nation. And it is curious because its structure is almost like that of an apology, a kind of a justification for the break with the Ottoman Sultanate and ultimately the Caliphate. And it's a pronouncement of the completion and consolidation of political authority of Mustafa Kemal, his party, and his state by late 1927. It itself caps off the process of the formation of the early republic, right? And in doing so, it cloaks or selectively frames all of the contingencies and indeterminacies within that process that we would really like to be studying as historians. So it's made it very difficult to get at those. This text did and continues to do a tremendous amount of work for the Republic and for the Turkish nation. It was then institutionalized, as we all know, I'm sure, serving as the framework and basis for the school curricula throughout Turkey for the history of the revolution. And it's interesting because in general, the sections about the early Republic are comparatively cursory and rushed, in contrast with the hundreds of pages about the mobilization of the national resistance movement and its transformation into the national independence movement and the incipient republic. So it thus became not just the master narrative, but the only narrative of the history of the early republic. And even now, almost a century later, I still feel it incumbent on me to begin a talk about the state of the art of early Republican historiography with Nutuk, because it still holds so much power, residual power, in shaping our understanding and blocking our critical engagement with the formation, with understanding the formation of the Republic. So and strangely, if it is possible for a historical narrative to be anti-historical, that is what it is. So the very enterprise of developing a critical history of the early Republic has been thwarted for a few generations by this text, very effectively. So how have we started to surmount this barrier? The barrier of Nutuk for the critical study of the early Republican period has been eroding, one could say, for 3 or 4 decades now. And let's just take the revisionist turns that have started to debunk the narrative in Nutuk and lead us toward a new and much more nuanced history. So the waves of revision, let's call them. And it's important to keep in mind that the first wave of revision to Nutuk came not from historians, but from Ataturk's own contemporaries with their counter memoirs, right? Personal accounts of the War of Independence, and to some extent the early Republic, generated by some individuals who were vilified in Nutuk, in fact, Rıza Nur, Rıza Tevfik, Kazım Karabekir, and others. Others who then also sought to validate and echo the narrative in Nutuk. But Nutuk became the kind of touchstone for all of these. These memoirs started appearing in the early multi-party period, already a trickle in the late 1940s, and more so in the 50s and 60s and beyond. As memoirs, anyone who's worked with these will know that they have their limitations and their possibilities for historians, but they begin at least to complicate the singular hegemony of Nutuk. So that's the first wave of revision. The second wave came, more recognizably from historians and literary scholars in the 1980s and into the early 2000s. Eric Jan Zohrab with his unionist factor in the 80s, leading through to Hülya Adak's article on Nutuk in the early 2000s. In different ways, these interventions helped us to see kind of underneath and outside of Nutuk, respectively. Zohrab gave us the unionist period, the concept of the unionist period, which for him, 1908 to 1950, which helps us see the establishment of the Republic as part, not as on a tabula rasa, but as part of a longer continuum, thereby forcing a fundamental revision to the narrative laid out in Nutuk. The fact that this revision even needed to be made was testament to the hold that Nutuk had had on the confines of the imagination for so many decades. Anyone coming at the topic naive to the politics would ask precisely these questions, as I mentioned at the beginning, about the extent of continuity from the late Ottoman to the Republican Turkish state. And yet, under the hegemony of Nutuk, it was unimaginable to ask that question. Furthermore, while Zohrab did not touch on this aspect in his original unionist factor, the question of culpability for the Armenian genocide was the elephant in the room, right? It was one of the crucial unspoken determinants for this narrative of rupture in Nutuk. That is to say, only by prohibiting the thought of continuity from the late Ottoman period to the Republican Turkish period could the question of culpability for the genocide be sidestepped. One of the drawbacks of Zohrab's revisionist move is in that he's in arguing for continuity in opposition to rupture, right, to that dominant narrative of rupture, is that, he's basically just providing the other side of a binary. It's difficult to move beyond either rupture or continuity, when actually, as historians, again, let's just pretend we're naive to the controversies for a moment. We all know that with most events in history, there are both ruptures and continuities going on. So it's made it difficult to get the nuance. But we started to do that recently. So an important adjunct to Zohrab's revision was, as I mentioned, the contribution of Hülya Adak. She put under scrutiny the narrative framework of Nutuk itself and offered crucial interpretive insights on it as a text, as an ego text and a nation text, right? Opening out into the conflation of Mustafa Kemal himself as narrator with the Turkish nation as hero or protagonist, right? And even kind of conveying the cognitive and even like the cosmological force that Nutuk had in shaping collective identity. So that's the scholarly revision, first round of that. The third wave of revision overall is a separate strand, but a very important one, and it touches on why this conference is being held, where it is being held. And it came out of the effort to explore the history and legacy of the Armenian genocide. Obviously, there were Armenian scholars long working on this, such as Raymond Kevorkian, Vacath Adrian, and others. I don't need to tell this group that. There were Turkish scholars then that came along, Taner Akçam. There were the combined efforts of the workshop in Armenian and Turkish studies started in the early 2000s by Mugrdechian, Norman Naimark, Ron Suni, and others are all part of this wave. The focus of their efforts was to develop a conversation and eventually a critical scholarship, and perhaps, we hope, even a consensus history of the Armenian genocide, an event which of course happened before the establishment of the Republic in 1923, so it takes us out a little bit of our purview. And we could have a whole conference around just the question of what that genocide had to do with the formation of the Republic, because it's a lot. In any case, Watts and the overall scholarly pursuit to document the policies and events associated with the genocide has had an important effect on the study of the early Republic itself. And again, Ümit and all of you are aware of this. A few hints at the fruit borne by these efforts and the lines of inquiry that emerged. First, the Turkish Republic was established not just in the wake of World War and the collapse of the empire, but in the aftermath of the genocide as a separate phenomenon. Seeing it in this light would include a consideration of the Armenian community within the empire and then within the Turkish Republic, as the work of Lerna Ekmekcioglu, Talin Suçyan, and others has accomplished and laid out an agenda for us. But the question is even more complex because we have to keep in mind that the very category of Turk was forged in this period and to some extent in response to the aftermath of the genocide. So it is all bound up. The question of rupture and then of continuity a la Zohrab between the Ottoman and Republican states is of course bound up with the continuity of unionism, of the Committee of Union and Progress, its personnel, its organizational and political structures, and its political culture. And that takes on a new significance when we try to view it as part of the larger picture, which includes the genocide, its aftermath, and questions of culpability and denial therein. We can say that Watts, including Göçek, including Peggy Anderson and others on German-Turkish relations into the Republican period, and of course the work of Taner Akçam and others have forced us to introduce all of these factors into one big conversation, which would and will eventually lead to a critical, comprehensive history of the early Republic. It also forces us to ask questions about what ended up being called minorities in the early Republic. And why do they matter in this moment of flux and formation, right? Do Armenians matter more than other minorities, Greeks, Jews, Kurds, others? And how? How do they matter differently? Because of the genocide and because of what other reasons, right? So there's a panoply of questions just about that. So I've introduced that separate strain of revision, right, into the picture. Now the fourth wave is one that, you know, may be the controversial one here, and it may be hard to believe because it may be hard for us to remember, but it's the wave that emanated from the AKP coalition, I think, when it was a coalition in the early years of AKP rule from 2003 until about 2015. Ironically, AKP helped to spark this with their early efforts to supplant a Kemalist framework, right? An effort which, you know, seems to have been unfinished and which ran up against the same problem as the Kemalists' recognition of the genocide. Sponsored by AKP, executed by scholars across the political spectrum who engaged at a critical distance from this Kemalist Nutuk narrative. Regardless of what AKP has evolved into by now, and Erdogan, what he has evolved into by now, we must concede that during the first 10 years of AKP rule, the most headway was made ever, really, in the production of historical knowledge about the genocide within Turkey. From the conference in 2005 by Turkish scholars to Fethiye Çetin's revelatory memoir, My Grandmother, which had a huge impact in Turkey and beyond. It might be a separate study that would look into the dynamics of that decade, 2002 to 2015, to see who and what factors were driving that knowledge production and why it came to an abrupt halt as AKP coalition crumbled, which happened to coincide with the centennial of the genocide, also to coincide with the Syrian war and the unraveling of the coalition. So it's, again, it's all bound up with a lot of factors, but it is part of the story of how we get from the early Republic to Nutuk to where we are now. So I think it shouldn't be left out of the picture. So where are we now? What is the state of the art? Well, we have it displayed before us and we're about to partake in it, which is great. And it is the most exciting moment to date to be studying and discussing the history of the early Republic. We're in the midst of an unfinished revisionist project, in fact, multiple related unfinished revisionist projects that when integrated have the potential not only to supersede Nutuk with a fully elaborated critical history of the early Republic, but to bring us to a consensus narrative of the Armenian genocide and its aftermath and its effect on the surviving elements of the Armenian community and the Republic, and really a new view of the formation of the early Republic with all of these factors brought into consideration. We might call it an externalist history of the early Republic rather than an internalist one that has dominated for so long. This is thanks to a new generation of both Armenian and Turkish scholars, as well as those that belong to neither group, many of whom are presenting here, who are interested in critically examining their own histories as well as those of the other, because they're all interrelated, and in unpacking the categories of belonging and of politics and seeing how they changed, and in tracking which actors shaped the processes of change and which actors chose different trajectories in response to the changes. We're finally at a point where we can go back to the intuitive questions that any historian would ask about the early republic, which I gave a sampling of when I began a few moments ago. And we can start to consider multiple stories simultaneously. The transition, which we might call a metamorphosis, a transformation and or an evolution from Ottoman political authority and sovereignty to a Turkish Republican one, taking account of the continuity of unionism in that process, as well as the formal and public denial of that continuity. Sources, we would of course want the Republican archives to be open to, and the Security Directorate archives to be open to scholars, so we could get a sense of the, because that's another barrier. In addition to Nutuk, it's Nutuk on the one hand, and then the lack of access to archives on the other for the early republic. So were those to be fully open, we'd get a sense of the complexity of the first 5 years of the republic. What were the alignments and realignments? How were the fissures from the War of Independence and the Armistice period and before still in play in the early republic, and how were they resolved, if at all? Here, Hakan Özalü's book comes to mind, From Caliphate to Secular State, which provided a great start to this conversation about the power struggles in the early republic. But there are many, many more questions that grow out of that. Beyond the state archives, we can for now pour through the newspapers of the first 5 years, or precisely the first year and a half between the foundation of the Republic and the law on the maintenance of order, which was promulgated in March 1925. Or we could go back a bit further to read systematically the press from 1918 through 25, or from 22 to 25. My sense in looking through some of the material from the Istanbul press from 23 to 25 is that the internal fissures and conflicts between Istanbul and Ankara were out in the open and discussed and debated in the press, and it's fascinating. And it stands in stark contrast to what comes out the other side after 1928. I found shocking instances of bold insubordination from Istanbul toward Ankara, demonstrating how shaky Ankara's hold on power was. And that's not something that's going to be admitted freely in Nutuk, for sure. I do not know the specifics of sources held in community archives for the Armenian community, but I am sure there is rich material that would fill out the story of the struggles of that community and the larger picture of the formation of the Republic through that prism. Same goes for the Greek community and the Patriarchate archives. These would have been considered irrelevant for the master narrative of the Republic and its formation in earlier decades, but I would guess that we would find surprising connections. And then deceptively simple would be the systematic exploration of the counter narratives that were generated in the early Republican period itself, before Mustafa Kemal had a chance to compose and deliver Nutuk. My own work has looked at Rafiq Halit Karai's Min el Bab ila Mihrab, which was a memoir about the armistice period written in 1923 and 24. And it was written to be a challenge to the early Republican authority. And publication of it was halted in Turkey after 2 installments in 1924. And that is a fascinating example of someone who tried to put together a narrative of the same years of the birth of the Republic, but before Nutuk itself was advanced. So it would be great to pursue that. What narratives were historical actors putting together? Because there were others besides this one. What kinds of stories were they putting together before Mustafa Kemal had a chance to forge Nutuk? In conclusion, these comments have really been meant to contextualize, foreground, and showcase the fascinating assemblage of papers we'll be discussing here. And I do think each of the papers is testament to these various lines of inquiry that are now possible. So I applaud you all, and I look forward to hearing your research.
Thank you, Dr. Philliou.
Thank you.
That was a wonderful sort of, as you said, situating the study of the early Turkish period, Republic period, and raised some very interesting questions that I think, as you said, some of our panelists will be addressing. And for those in the audience and others that are interested, it will also raise some questions which which will need to be addressed. So thank you very much for your presentation. We
you.
will have again an opportunity at the end of all three presentations for a discussion among the panelists and also among our audience. Our next speaker is Deacon Dr. Christopher Shuklian. He is the director of the Krior and Clara Zohrab Information Center. It's a research library and presentation space attached to the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Apostolic Church in New York. He also serves as an adjunct professor at St. Nerses Armenian Seminary. He received a bachelor's degree in anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley, and his master's and then his doctorate in anthropology from the University of Chicago. And his dissertation was entitled Theology and the Community, the Armenian Minority, Tradition, and Secularism in Turkey. Prior to his appointment as the director of the Zohrab Information Center, Dr. Shuklian was a Manugian postdoctoral fellow in Armenian studies at the University of Michigan. He has also taught at the University of Chicago, the University of Michigan, and Wesleyan University. He specializes in the anthropology of religion and secularism, studying the role of liturgy and law in the lives of religious minorities, and has published on these topics. He is going to be presenting a paper on Armenians and the problem space of secularism in the early Turkish Republic. Dr. Shuklian.
Thank you, Barlow, for that introduction, and thank you to both Ümit and to Barlow for the invitation. I'm really thrilled to be here. Although from my bio there, you might have caught that I'm a bit of an interloper. My expertise is more on contemporary Turkey, though a lot of what I have worked on, as you will see in my comments this evening, really takes up a bit of this question of the rupture and continuity, because I have argued and articulated that I think to understand the place of Armenians in the Republic of Turkey today, you've got to really understand what happened in that sort of in this transition moment. And so much of what happens in the period under consideration today and tomorrow sets the parameters for what life for Armenians in Turkey is like all the way to the present. So that's sort of where I come in, and I'm going to kind of think through some of these conceptual problems around secularism, maybe without as much knowledge and specificity of the time period and its all of its complexity. So with that, I'll give my comments here. So laiklik, the Turkish calque on the French laicité, is enshrined in the Constitution of the Republic of Turkey. Secularism, and I'm here going to ignore the conceptual distinctions that some people make between secularism and laicism. We can take these up if we want later. Secularism is a foundational principle of the modern Republic of Turkey, one of the pillars of the ideology often known as Kemalism, after the founder of the modern republic, and a central animating principle of much of Turkish politics in the 20th and 21st century. Unlike other countries where the ideological underpinnings of secularism often enter public debate, we can think about arguments about school prayer or court cases on the Establishment Clause here in the United States. In Turkey, secularism itself is frequently the object of discussion and debate. By way of anecdote, in 2008, when I first visited Turkey, there was, as many of you I'm sure recall, a court case that nearly shuttered the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, the AK party that has been mentioned already, that's the current governing party of Turkey. Over the question, this is what the court case was about, the question of whether or not it had become a focal point of anti-secular activity. I was struck by the intensity over the debates in the newspapers around the definition, understanding, importance, and place of secularism itself. Now, again, this is not simply about the place of religion in the public sphere, but specifically about the importance of the political principle of secularism. So secularism is absolutely central to any social, political, or historical analysis of the Republic of Turkey. And many academic works, of course, have grappled with the central place of secularism in the history of the Republic. I'm thinking, for instance, of Soner Çağatay's book, Islam, Secularism, and Nationalism in Modern Turkey, Who is a Turk? Ezra Özyürek's Nostalgia for the Modern, the works of Hakan Yavuz. These are just some of the texts that have placed secularism front and center in the analysis of Turkish history and politics. Tellingly, and actually I think Christine kind of set this up really nicely, tellingly, many of these books date to the early years of the rule of the AKP. In other words, the emergence of the AKP as a dominant force in Turkish politics not only led to discussions about secularism in the public sphere in Turkey, but also generated increased scholarly interest in the topic. In addition to the place of secularism in the Republic of Turkey, the idea of the emergence of secular politics in the late Ottoman Empire has also held some sway over Ottomanists. The classic, though not unproblematic text, articulating this idea of a development of secularism is Niyazi Berkez's The Development of Secularism in Turkey. If this is one of the few books that puts secularism so explicitly at the forefront, many classic problems in Ottoman historiography have been explained through the dynamic of the emergence of secularism. Just kind of front and center in my mind, Roderick Davison's classic essay, The Advent of the Principle of Representation in the Government of the Ottoman Empire, and other debates around representation clearly posit modern secular forms of politics. Another central problem in Ottoman historiography is the so-called Millet System. Often the changes, or an initial constitution, depending on your position in those debates, the changes in the millets in the 19th century are often described as a secular transition from a religious to an ethno-national basis for these groups. Now, of course, by bringing us to the Millet System, it's clear that the historiography of Armenians within the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Turkey are deeply implicated in any debate about secularism. Yet the specific problematic of secularism has received scant attention in extant accounts of Armenians in either the Ottoman Empire or Turkey. Lerna Ekmekcioglu, in her truly groundbreaking study of Armenians in the early Republican period and in that transition period, describes the situation of Armenians in the Republic of Turkey as secular dimitude, calling Armenians secular dhimmis of the Republic. More recently, Zovanar Derderian, in her really brilliant dissertation, notes that the field of Ottoman studies has yet to engage in a critical examination of the secular and the processes of secularization. Derderian here is referring to a critical body of literature in the social sciences that has fundamentally changed the way we think about the secular and secularism. Derderian quotes one of the foremost representatives of what we might term critical studies of secularism, Sabah Mahmud, to make the point that the long-standing approach to secularism in Ottoman studies of secularism as the separation of the religious and the lay overlooks the more complex phenomenon of secularization as a process that entails fundamental shifts in conception of self, time, space, ethics, and morality, as well as a reorganization of social, political, and religious life. So in bringing Mahmud's work to bear on the study of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, Derderian has done us a great service. Yet the application of critical studies of secularism to Ottoman historiography, let alone the study of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Turkey, remains in its early infancy. In what follows tonight, my goal is to articulate why secular and secularism are central categories for understanding the lives of Armenians in the Republic of Turkey. I lay out the position of these critical studies of secularism and argue that adopting such a standpoint on secularism clarifies and brings into sharp relief several important debates about the status of Armenians in the early and later, as I pointed out to my own ethnographic research, Republic of Turkey. Pointing to some of these debates, as well as institutions and potential archives, I conclude by sketching what might be future lines of inquiry. So much of what I'm calling here critical studies of secularism derives from the work of anthropologist Talal Asad. In a pair of books spanning a decade, Genealogies of Religion and Formations of the Secular, Asad fundamentally reoriented the discussion of secularism. Previously, secularism was seen as part and parcel of the inevitable decline of religion for the importance of human culture and society. In such highly schematic progressivist narratives, the secular is a kind of bedrock on which religion was overlaid. Slowly, with the help of science and modern politics, that extra accretion of religion was scraped away, and we're left with the really real of the secular. The rise in the study of secularism in the 1990s, marked by publication like Secularism and Its Critics, or Jose Casanova's Public Religions in the Modern World, was the intellectual response to the gnawing realization that with Reagan and the moral majority, this decline of religion thesis was untenable. These earlier works on secularism tried to retain certain portions of the secularization thesis, or tried to rescue certain ways of thinking about the secular religious division while jettisoning the high modernism of a strong progressivist decline of religion narrative. It is at this point in the debate that Talal Asad makes his remarkable intervention. Asad's fundamental insight was to see that the category of religion was in itself part of the process of secularization. In other words, neither secular nor religious are primordial ontological categories. Rather, the opposition secular-religious is itself a kind of mark of the secular episteme, one that creates a bounded object, religion, that is seen in fundamental opposition to the secular. As I like to sort of flippantly tell it, in earlier centuries in medieval Europe, religion as we recognize it today simply did not exist. There was the one true Catholic and holy faith, the Church of Rome. Then there were schismatics, heretics, infidels, pagans. And Armenians would have fallen somewhere among those, actually, from the perspective of the Church of Rome. The idea that Pope Urban II conceived of the Church of Rome and the Muslims who occupied the Holy Land as fundamentally the same thing, namely a religion, is simply preposterous. In other words, the category of religion itself is an epistemic product of a later time period. As Asad puts it, secularism isn't simply separation of religious from secular institutions and government, though that is a part of it. Rather, quoting him, what is distinctive about secularism is that it presupposes new concepts of religion, ethics, and politics, and new imperatives associated with them. He also distinguishes between the secular as an epistemic category from secularism as a political doctrine. So this is, as Asad recognizes, a difficult conceptual position, one that's tough to grasp, and one that I would definitely say is even harder to write from. What do you do if you recognize this category of religion maybe isn't so stable? How do you write about it? This becomes a really sort of difficult thing for someone who takes up this position. So even scholars who have grasped that secularization in the 19th century in the Ottoman Empire was not simply the inevitable acceptance of a modern political idea imposed from outside, from Europe, but rather a kind of totalizing sea change that brought with it things like ideas about representation, often still treat religion itself as a kind of stable object. If religion is a stable ontological object, then the question of secularism revolves around changes to that stable object. For instance, in his excellent book out this year, Brokers of Faith, Brokers of Empire, Richard Antaramian argues convincingly for a revision of our understanding of the 19th century reform period in the Ottoman Empire. He suggests that reform did not secularize, but rather politicized religion and Armenian church offices in a manner that they had never been previously in Ottoman governance. This is an astute observation that recognizes the political role Armenian clergymen played in the 19th century in the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, by leaving religion as a stable category, I would posit that it doesn't go far enough. It is not, from an Asadian perspective, that we need to adjudicate between a secularized religion stripped from its role in the public sphere, between that and a politicized one that played a certain crucial part in the public sphere. But rather, we should recognize that religion itself emerged as a recognizable something, and that it had a bounded role to play in society. An Armenian clergyman in the 15th century might be a hierarch, a diplomat, philosopher, civic leader, and father confessor all at the same time, because the Armenian church was not merely a religion, but instead an ecclesial confessional body that did much more than what today we assign to the role of religion. While perhaps a nuanced position, if we take this fundamental starting point from the critical study of secularism, we might begin to ask different questions of Armenians in the late Ottoman Empire, the early Republic of Turkey, and in Turkey today. Often, debates about secularism in the Republic of Turkey argue over whether Turkey was truly a secular state, if it today has backslid from its earlier, more pristine secular status, etc. However, I would follow Hüseyin Agrama, one of the most important theorists to deploy Asad's insights. We should consider the secularism of the Republic of Turkey and secularism in general less as a doctrine or norm about the line between the secular and the religious, and instead think of it as a problem space. This is a term that Agrama takes from David Scott's work. So Agrama urges us to see secularism as a set of processes and structures of power wherein the question of where to draw a line between religion and politics continually arises and acquires a distinctive salience. Whenever a state is embroiled in the question of religion and politics, of where and how to distinguish between them, then that state is fundamentally operating with the premises of political secularism. So what does this mean for Armenians in the Republic of Turkey, or for our study of Armenians at this moment between, the Ottoman and the fully fleshed Republican Turkey? Well, first, it should unsettle some classic historiographic debates about Armenians in the Ottoman Empire and in the early Republican period. First and foremost among these is the perennial question of the Millet system. From this perspective, it's not that millets were religious groupings that were secularized as they became modern nations. Rather, a millet was a fundamentally different kind of grouping, one that we can only anachronistically apprehend as blurring the lines of ethno-national and religious. Millets did not blur ethnicity and religion because those categories, prior to the emergence of a secular episteme, were not such easily separable, distinguishable categories. This forces us to consider the millets in their collective, ecclesial, and administrative specificity. I've argued for this in more detail, and we can think through this as questions, but I don't want to detain us here further. And I especially don't want to get detained here because this points us to another important historiographic debate, one that Christine has already pointed out for us, namely between continuity and rupture between the Ottoman and the Republican period. Millet and the possible continuation of a Millet or Millet-like understanding of the place of Armenians in the Republic of Turkey colors much of how we think about Armenians in the early Republic. As alluded to earlier, Lerna Ekmekcioglu offers the provocative figure of the secular dhimmi of the Republic as a way of pointing both to the break, i.e. the secular part, and to the continuity, that there's still this kind of dhimmi understanding. The approach to secularism I'm advocating here would reconfigure the debate slightly, attuning us not only to the fact that Armenians made use of certain dhimmi strategies, but that in their encounter with the nascent Turkish state, the problem space of secularism rendered the earlier Millet organization deeply uncomfortable. And Millet holds the ethno-national and the religious together in a way that secularism declares should be kept separate. The uncomfortable continuities across the Ottoman Republican divide has set the parameters for much of state-minority interaction in the entire Republican period. So in a sense, what I'm suggesting is that if we insist on certain secular categories and a neat division of secular religious or political religious, that we'll face the modes of action available to Armenians in Republican Turkey. Many of the continuities across the Ottoman Republican divide were institutional, but those institutions caused deep anxiety within the problem space of secularism. If attention to this problem space allows us to reconsider this classic relationship between the ethno-national and the religious, that's one thing it helps us to do. And if it also maybe gives us a lens, or we could think of it as maybe another front in the question of rupture and continuity. The other thing it does is it pushes us to consider institutions that survive the transition and to look how they inevitably brush up against the precepts of political secularism. I'm thinking here of a couple specifics. The most obvious, of course, is the patriarchate. And Talin Suchin, who's one of our speakers here, has written really beautifully about this in Armenians in Modern Turkey. She gave real careful attention to the institution of the patriarchate and the role that it continued to play in the early and, we could say sort of middle, maybe Republican period. The other thing that I want to spend a little time with as I finish up here is an institution that really Suchin is one of the only few people to pay close attention to, which is the institution of the Vacath. Now, I don't have time to treat the Vacaths with the care and attention I'd like to, but these crucial nodes of the Armenian community in Turkey boggle the secularist mind. That often, Vacath is often translated as charitable religious endowment or a religious foundation, but they're hospitals with chapels on them. They're schools and churches smushed together in the same grounds. They're often institutional launching pads for arguments about representation within the Armenian community or to the Turkish state. Sometimes they articulate a pan-non-Muslim politics. So in a way, starting from the problem space of secularism, where the relationship between politics and religion is central, forces certain questions about the Vacaths on us. What happens if we refuse those questions and ask different ones? What forms of action might emerge? What kinds of collective activity suddenly become intelligible? I've taken up some of these questions in my dissertation and published work for a more contemporary period, but there's much to be learned from the Vacaths, the debates over them, the projects launched from them, and more for this early Republican period. Now, many of the archives related to these institutions are either partial or sort of rather inaccessible, but I'm certain that there are many things to be gleaned from what can be accessed. Secularism, in a way, leads us to the Vacaths. It sort of says, what do we do with this weird thing that seems to blur the lines between the secular and the religious? But then by placing the lens of secularism front and center as we approach the Vacaths, we have a couple advantages. One is that this is a concrete point of friction or contact between the emergent Turkish state and Armenians. And it provides us a way of thinking about that friction. The ministry of Vacaths was modeled on the older Ottoman ministry of the same name, but all non-Muslim Vacaths were sort of grandfathered in as so-called community Vacaths. The reorganization vis-a-vis Armenians could tell us quite a bit about the place of Armenians in the nascent Turkish Republic. We have, through the work of the Hrant Dink Foundation, much information about the loss of Vacath property, which of course tells us much about the place of Armenians. But what was happening in Vacath leadership at the time? How did Armenians reconceive of the role of the Vacaths, given all the difficulties placed on their management? And here Suchin has offered quite a bit of detail about the single trustee system period. But I think there's just so much more that can be done looking at these institutions across periods, but certainly in this really early moment. And at the same time, thinking through the critical studies of secularism forces us to recognize when the problem space of secularism overwhelms our analysis of something like the Vacaths. So what happens if we try to bracket out this problem space? What do they do, these Vacaths? How do they function? What do they tell us about Armenian agency in the early Republic? Some of these questions are only possible if we set aside Vacath as an institution that blurs religious and secular activity and instead look at the specificity of the institution. In a way, these advantages are the same that I think the approach of the critical study of secularism offers to the historiography of the early Turkish Republic overall. And this is where I'll kind of point to these things and end. Secularism becomes the political imperative at the heart of the Turkish Republic. Certain ways of life, certain institutions, certain activities become problematic. If religion and politics must be kept separate, much of Armenian life as it was circumscribed in the Ottoman Empire becomes problematic. So secularism helps us identify concrete points of friction. At the same time, the critical study of secularism reminds us not to be overwhelmed by that problem space of secularism and helps us perhaps to ask different questions. This promises to unearth actors and agencies, institutions, archives, points of continuity, points of rupture, who all otherwise might have gone overlooked. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sheklian. That was provocative in the way that you rethought the question of the understanding of secularism, and I think it will give us a lot of questions that will need to be answered and thinking about. So thank you very much. Our next speaker tonight is Erdem Ilter. Erdem Ilter is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. He specializes in late Ottoman Empire and early Turkish Republic period. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree from a dual diploma program at the State University of New York at Binghamton and Middle East Technical University, and continued to get his Master of Arts at the State University of New York. At UCLA, his dissertation title is The Ottoman Imperial Legacy on Turkish Nation Building, an analysis of the General Inspectorates, 1895 to 1945. And this is also going to be the topic of his presentation this evening. Erdem?
Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Barlow of Mugrdechian and Dr. Ümit for organizing this conference. It has been great, and I already started to question some of my arguments, and we will discuss that more. So when I, received the invitation from the organizers, I was working on my dissertation prospectus, and it was really exciting for me because, the theme and also the time period that the conference is covering is fitting my research interest perfectly. So what I'm going to present is kind of the skeleton of my dissertation, which is waiting to be written, inshallah, in the next year or two. So I'm looking at this conference, as an opportunity to get some critical feedback to improve my thesis. So it is not as coherent as paper. So I try to make it, but I guess it's not. But anyway, bear with me, and then at the end, I will share a map with you, and also my main arguments as kind of as a list. So even though the conference goal is to focus on the period starting from 1908 to 1945, I would like to start my periodization from 1895. And of course, periodization, just like any other, is open to discussion. And I'm hoping to generate a conversation in that regard. The reason that I propose a different periodization is because I prefer to focus on the spatio-bureaucratic management rather than focusing on the demographic engineering projects that accelerated during the Young Turk period and were maintained during the Kemalist period. And I'm looking at the state construction, Turkish state construction or Ottoman state building, not in terms of the Ottoman relationship or Turkish relationship vis-a-vis Europe, West, but actually the Ottoman and Turkish relationship vis-a-vis the East, Armenians, and the Kurds. So my paper examined a set of administrative units from the late Ottoman Empire called the General Inspectorate, Umumi Müfettişlikler, which survived the transition from empire to nation state in the Republic of Turkey. They're emblematic of a series of administrative continuities and ideological shifts from the Hamidian to Young Turk and the Kemalist periods. The paper explores these continuities and shifts by analyzing Ottoman and Turkish responses to various political crises and examining the strategies they employed to enforce their authority at the eastern region of the empire. By researching the origins of the General Inspectorate, it will scrutinize the spatio-bureaucratic management of a region encompassing Armenia or Kurdistan or Eastern Anatolia, Vilayet Sharkiye or Vilayet Sitte between 1895 and 1952. And I use all these terms interchangeably, specifically when I'm covering the Hamidian and the Young Turk period, and they're all problematic and loaded with historical, political, and emotional baggage, but I won't be able to go into details, because of the limited time. So the first General Inspectorate emerged in this region in 1895 as part of an Ottoman imperial strategy during a period when the great powers were heavily involved in local affairs, especially after the Congress of Berlin in 1878. The stated purpose of the inspectorate was to rule the eastern provinces during the enduring political turmoil under the reign of Sultan Abdülhamid II. The institution later became standard governmental division used to govern Eastern Anatolia during Turkey's period of one-party rule. The first inspectorate was founded during the Kemalist period, 1927, and then abolished in 1952. The Turkish parliament abolished the General Inspectorate during the second year of the Democrat Party's rule in 1952, the same Turkey in the NATO. As the newest member of the liberal democratic camp, Turkey wanted to prove its devotion to democratization. It help from the West against the Soviet Union or the Soviet threat. However, with some exceptions, an assortment of Turkish elites appointed centrally from the civilian military bureaucracy have governed Kurdistan, Eastern Anatolia, maintaining the legacy of the General Inspectorates. The General Inspectorates, all powerful and brutally effective institutions, played a significant role in shaping the main characteristics of the modern Turkish state. The emergent post-genocide nation state built upon and borrowed from the Ottoman imperial and colonial administrative know-how. To consolidate power, Republican Turkey relied on institutions such as the General Inspectorates and their functionaries from various regions of the empire, including the Balkans and Eastern Anatolia. Under the rule of powerful inspector generals, Eastern Anatolia became a laboratory for the Kemalist civilizing project mission. The special regime of inspectorates formed internal borders demarcated along racialized ethnic lines and imposed a dual legal system in different regions of the country. As a result, the clash of imperial know-how and Kurdish resistance institutionalized the authoritarian and, to a certain extent, racist characteristics of the state. The goal of this paper, therefore, is to demonstrate how a particular memory of the Kemalist, historical memory of the Kemalist, played a role in their response to the periphery's resistance, and how in return that resistance solidified the unique characteristics of the Kemalist regime throughout the 1920s and 30s. So just to give some quick background, the institution of the General Inspectorate, as I mentioned, first appeared during the reign of Sultan Hamid II. The outcome of Berlin forced the Ottoman Empire to implement reforms in order to improve the social and political conditions in Ottoman Armenia, or eastern provinces of the empire, where most of the Ottoman Armenians were living. Under the immense pressure from the Europeans for reforms in the region after a series of Armenian massacres in Sassoon in 1894-95, Abdülhamid II announced a broad reform plan, Islahat Layihası, in the 6 provinces and appointed Ahmet Shakir Pasha, one of his top consultant, Yaveri Ekrem, as the Inspector General of the Anatolian provinces on June 27, 1895. The Sultan gave Shakir Pasha extensive administrative powers to implement the negotiated judicial, administrative, and financial reforms prepared on the one hand by the Ottomans, British, French, and the Russians, and on the other by some Armenian elites. So despite the limited financial support, Shakir Pasha imposed reforms throughout the duration of his post until he died from 1895 to 1899 to ease the regional tension. More crucial than the activities of Shakir Pasha, however, was the emergence of a new way in which the Ottoman Empire imagined and governed dissent in this particular geography. The general inspectorship regime became a model of routine administration in the eastern periphery that outlasted its founders and was reinforced even after the dismemberment of the empire. The region, which comprised Van, Erzurum, Bitlis, Mamaratul Aziz, Sivas, Diyarbakir, was called the 6 provinces, Vilayet-i Sitte, with the foundation of the first General Inspectorate. I don't exactly know how they came about this name, but based on my archival research, I can tell it was part of avoiding, calling the region Armenia and to a certain extent Kurdistan. Because what you see in the documents throughout the 1880s and 90s is a constant effort to deny the population density of the Armenians in the region, and related to that, arguing that there is no possibility for Armenian autonomy or statehood. So naming the region Vilayet-i Sitte was actually part of that strategy. That is why I marked the foundation of the first General Inspectorate in the region to govern the 6 provinces as a turning point. I see this as the process of creation of a distinct administration in the East and consolidation of state power there. After the foundation of the first General Inspectorate in 1895, all political actors, the Ottomans, Armenian parties, great powers, Kurdish notables, tribal leaders, sheikhs, they started to see the region as a single administrative unit that has to be governed by them. I mean, whoever is representing the group that they claim. So in other words, the Vilayet-i Sitte was officially accepted as a separate region that needs to be governed differently than the rest of the empire. The Ottoman strategy was ruling the region under a single authority appointed by the imperial center. And that particular approach to the region was maintained by the Unionists and the Kemalists in the coming years. For example, The negotiations between the Armenian parties, the Unionists and the Great Powers in 1914 about reforming and governing the region were built on that existing framework. They did not question why the region needed separate administration from the rest of the empire. The negotiation was mostly about who was going to control that existing distinct administrative political unit. So for some scholars, this is a turning point in terms of the Unionist decision on carrying out the genocide because they lost control of the inspectorate. Since I'm not expert on that, I will leave that to our discussion. So in that sense, the Kemalists too accepted the same model during the first 2 decades of their rule over Eastern Anatolia. According to a document that I recently found in the Republican archives, as early as December 1925, the Kemalists got their hands on Shakir Pasha's reform plan for the East. And as I mentioned, Shakir Pasha, was the first general inspectorate appointed by Sultan Abdulhamid II. And what I'm wondering now is to what extent the Kemalists utilized Shakir Pasha's report while they prepare their own famous reform plan for the East, which I'm going to talk about, which is known as the Sharq Islahat Planı, or Reform Plan for the East. The Kemalists reestablished and reformulated the general inspectorates during the era of European mandates in the Middle East. They employed the racist European civilizational discourse to legitimize the creation of these general inspectorates in Eastern Anatolia, which became tools for their internal colonization project. Kemalist inspectorates utilized Ottoman imperial know-how and colonial practices alongside new technologies of rule to subjugate the Kurdish population in their attempt to construct a homogeneous nation. So the creation of the general inspectorates in the infant Turkish Republic followed Sheikh Said rebellion, which started in Diyarbakir and Elazığ in February 1925. The Kemalists used the rebellion as a pretext to repress the growing opposition and to consolidate their power by passing the famous Takrir-i Sükun Kanunu, law for the maintenance of order. This law allowed the Kemalists to gain full control of the military, declare martial law in Kurdish cities, close down opposition newspapers, and ban the only opposition party. The law remained in place until October 27 and 1927 and imposed military rule on major Kurdish cities. After lifting the martial law, the Kemalists crafted a permanent plan, which included forming general inspectorates to subjugate the Kurds and govern the region. While the Sheikh Said rebellion provided the ground for Kemalists to amass power in Ankara, subsequent Kurdish rebellions, and there are more than 10, like some small, some regional, enabled the regime to institutionalize its authoritarian structure. One such rebellion was the long-lasting Mount Ararat rebellion from 1926 to 1930. So the foundation of the general inspectorates and the decades-long imposition of martial law in the Kurdish region was central to the Kemalist project for several reasons. Eastern Anatolia, as I mentioned, Kurdistan, became a laboratory for the Kemalists to test their civilizing and social engineering projects, which they orchestrated through forced settlements, population transfers, and forced assimilation. While social engineering projects predate the Kemalist regime, this was the first time that a regime had combined all these practices systematically to radically transform both a targeted population and also the landscape of a particular region. The administrative, cultural, and political transformation of the Kurdish region featured prominently in the affirmation of the superiority of the Turkish race, improving the efficacy of the Kemalist modernization project. So the Kemalist government, in colonizing and modernizing Kurdistan, also wanted to prove to the rival European colonialists that they were political and racial equals. After all, in order to civilize others, one must be already civilized. So likewise, the first general inspector, Avni Doğan, declared the settlement of the, I'm quoting, the settlement of the Republic in the East is similar to the civilized nation's settlement of Africa. Who has the right to claim that we are less than the civilized nations who settle in Africa? which has a much more difficult climate compared to Diyarbakir, end quote. So throughout the 1930s, Kemalists challenged European depictions of Turks as members of the inferior yellow race. The racialization of ethnicities became a part of the mainstream state process of knowledge production. And the Kemalists institutionalized race science through the foundation of the Turkish Historical Society in 1931, the Turkish Language Association in 1932, and the Turkish Institute of Anthropology in 1933. Turkish scholars, mostly trained in Europe with race scientists, led these institutions and produced an enormous pseudoscientific literature to both contest and build on the dominant European scientific discourse of the period, while confronting European racial discourse by creating their own pseudoscientific racist theories. The Kurdish resistance offered them a means of implementing their ideas. Accordingly, repressing the rebellions of the backward Kurd did not simply mean the elimination of a political threat, but was proof of the modern, technologically advanced Turkish state and the superiority of the Turks as member of the white race. So the pages of Turkish publications during this period are full of cartoons depicting, Turkish authorities in Western clothes, wielding advanced weapons, and smashing the heads of the Kurds standing on rocks, armed with, outdated rifles and wearing traditional Kurdish garb. In other words, the Kemalists, more than competing with Europeans discursively, affected their racial ideas with the occupation and transformation of Eastern Anatolia. So these interactions between the young Turkish Republic and the Kurds shaped the main characteristics of the Turkish state. The inspectorates carried out the most significant mission throughout the 1920s and 1930s to solve the young republic's Kurdish question. Primarily, the inspectorates delimited Turkey's geographical, cultural, economic, administrative, and legal borders along the Turkish-Kurdish dichotomy. Ruling the Kurdish majority cities through the inspectorates resulted in the formation of internal borders within Turkey. So the administrative practices in Eastern Anatolia created a whole generation of civilian and military bureaucrats carrying out the mission of forced assimilation and subjugation of the Kurds. The Kurdish region saw the establishment of this battle-hardened and repressive government first before it expanded to the rest of the country. Their administrative and military practices in Kurdistan and their responses to the Kurdish resistance radicalized the government in Ankara and cemented its power under the absolute rule of Kemal Atatürk. Kemalist elites found themselves constantly embroiled in internal conflicts while still living under the fear of European occupation, mobilizing tens of thousands of soldiers to carry out military operations and building infrastructure for the occupation of the Kurdish region. Such actions necessitated authoritarian governmental customs from the newly formed republic. Indeed, the Kemalist government established the Third Inspectorate in 1934 in Thrace, the far west of the country, just months before the eruption of pogroms against the Jews living there. So the regime of inspectorates created in Eastern Anatolia, Kurdistan, triggered the emergence of an unofficial dual law system in Turkey. So the literature that we have been talking about widely accepts the official Turkish state narrative, which claims the equality in the enforcement of a single set of laws for each citizen, regardless of their ethnic, religious, cultural, or economic background. Voices critical of the state's policies against the Kurds denounced the Turkish government for not implementing the law equally. What I argue is that there was no set of laws that was universally applicable, apart from the official code of laws, which was still discriminatory and permitted the perpetration of certain crimes against the Kurds. In Eastern Anatolia, unofficial laws traced ethnic racial lines and targeted only that region. This is why, with some exceptions, the state has denied the Kurds the ability to govern themselves throughout the history of the Turkish Republic, even at the municipal level, despite some exceptions, though they officially have the rights to vote and run for elected offices. So in one form or another, martial law under the supervision of centrally appointed governors, as well as civilian and military bureaucrats, has governed the Kurdish region since mid-1920s. So I will pause here and share the map that I mentioned, and also summarize my main arguments. Okay. So this is the region that I'm mainly talking about, that became a different or separate administrative unit, the 6 provinces, and those are my main arguments. So 1, Eastern Anatolia, Armenia, Kurdistan, Vilayet-i Sitte, Vilayet-i Sharqiye, whatever you want to call, emerged as a distinct region in 1895 with the foundation of the first General Inspectorate in the region and appointment of Shakir Pasha as the Inspector General, or what you can call, according to British, High Commissioner. The idea that this region is different from the rest of the empire and has to be ruled accordingly was largely accepted by all local parties involved in the matter: Armenians, Kurds, Ottomans, and great powers. Both Unionists and the Kemalists shaped their policies toward the region based on that existing model. General inspectorates as an institution played a significant role in terms of ruling Eastern Anatolia, Kurdistan, during the Kemalist rule throughout the 1920s and 30s. And the Kurdish resistance that continued during 1920s and 30s played a significant role in shaping the policies of the Kemalists and the authoritarian characteristics of the regime. And we can add secularism to that, because most of those Kurdish leaders were actually sheikhs, and it was kind of a, effort to undermine the Kurdish religious authority, like their emphasis on secularism. The general inspectorates became tools of internal colonization and served the Turkish government, helping them measure and build their civilizing projects in Kurdistan. In that sense, the general inspectorates were a crucial component of the state building process in Turkey. And lastly, the legacy, ruling the region with an assortment of civil and military bureaucrats according to a different set of laws, continues until today. So I will end here, and I'm looking forward for your criticism and questions and comments.
Thank you, Erdem. Very interesting on the general inspectorates. And what we're going to do at this point is to go ahead and open it up for questions. So please use the question and answer function of Zoom to ask the questions. And as you're doing so, I'm going to open it up to the panelists if they would like to ask each other perhaps a question to start a little bit of the discussion. So if there's any one of the panelists that would like to ask another one a question or part of that, we can start with that. Yeah, go ahead. You'll have to just unmute yourself and then go ahead. We'll start with Christine first.
Thank you. Yeah, I had a question for Erdem. Were there general inspectorates in Macedonia? And is that the same story that you're telling, or is that a different kind of thing?
Yes, exactly. And I couldn't cover it because it is, just we have limited time, but I talk about that in my prospectus. And it is actually related to that. And that's kind of the discussion that I'm having. I talk about it as the new way of, governing the periphery, if you want to call it, because the same thing happened in Macedonia after the Bulgarian revolt, and then they combined 3 cities and created Vilayet-i Selase in this case, so 3 provinces, and then appointed Hilmi Pasha, who was coming from, Yemen, as the general inspectorate of that region. And it seems like, they liked what happened in Eastern Anatolia, in Vilayet-i Sitte, and then they applied the same model in Rumeli. And what is interesting is, something similar happened during the Kemalist period as well, because the second inspectorate was actually found in Trakya, in Thrace. So it's also, of course, the different context and the story is different, but just to show the state, like my goal is kind of to show that the state was actually built, from the periphery rather than built, saying that it went from the certain anyway, sorry. So I will stop here for now because I'm a little bit tired. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question. This question is to, again, Erdem. In your research, what names of civil and military bureaucrats did you come across who were also in the former members of the CUP? So were there former members of the CUP that became later civil or military bureaucrats?
Okay, another great question, and that's again something else that I'm covering in my perspective, because it's not just it's not just accepting the model, but also the inspectorship was actually carried with similar figures, like Tahsin Uzer. He was I think he was a mutasarrif in Vilayet-i Selase, in the Rumelian inspectorship. And then in 1916, he was governor of Erzurum. And then in 1935, he became the third general inspectorate in the same region, in Eastern Anatolia. So there is that continuity as well. And also Shukri Kaya, the governor of, I'm not sure if governor of Halep. So again, they actually use the same people. So what I'm, trying to show, actually, those, I don't want to call them middlemen, but there are other kind of the empire or state makers. So rather than focusing on Kemal Atatürk or İnönü or ideologies, we actually should look at those people who already got experience during the late Hamidian period, during the, Young Turk period, and also played a significant role during the Kemalist period. So they're the empire makers or state makers.
So Ümit had asked that question, and then specifically he was asking about Celal Bayar, because he wants to write a book on him, or he is writing a book on him. So
then maybe you should tell us about him. Because
we'll ask him
yeah.
tomorrow. Christine, I have a question
Tomorrow,
for you.
yeah.
Dating back to the Nutuk, to the first great speech of Kemal, did he at all place the role of minorities in that? Where did he include them at all in this narrative, or was it just a beginning from nothing and it was just Turkishness from the beginning?
Well, it begins defined in opposition to the minorities, indeed, because the first pages of it are all about why he had to go to Samsun on assignment. I'm sure Turks in the room can say this in even more detail, but it was all about putting down the brigandage that was happening in 1919 by the Armenians and the Rum and the Greeks. So and that's one of many. And then of course, like the Greek landing at Izmir, and all of the minorities come in as the impetus for the mobilization of the national movement. So it's the internal minorities combined with the external enemies are really what defines Turkishness in Nutuk, right? It's the struggle against the internal and the external enemies. So I would say that's mostly where they come in. Yeah.
Okay. Does any of our other panelists have any questions for each other? We still waiting for some questions from the audience. So if you have questions for each other or points of discussion or.
Oh, Ümit, yes, for me. Hi.
Oh, there, we got to do it in the chat. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead,
Yes.
Ümit has got to go ahead and write it out, so that's all right.
We're here. We're not going anywhere.
I'm gonna have a question for Christopher in the meanwhile while he's asking that question. So when you talked about the secularism, and I know that you don't specifically look at the early Republican period, but you were talking about the Vacaths. Did the Armenians, how did they negotiate that? Were they able to negotiate that change from the Ottoman to the nationalists? I mean, to the new republic. I don't know if you've looked at that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I actually like. I mean it when I sort of point to it as something that I hope becomes a site of future research. One that I would like to take up in order to have a better understanding of their role today, but that I think probably would be fruitful in any number of ways. But the sketch of it is the way in which very diverse peoples and things were all then grouped together as this special thing that I translate as community foundation, which becomes the sort of euphemism for the non-Muslim foundations. And then what is interesting is that unlike basically there's a kind of closure on opening new foundations, and everything that becomes a new foundation within the Republic gets funneled into a different category. But no new community foundations are possible at all. So any foundation that an Armenian opens up subsequent to the foundation of the Republic is in a different administrative category than all of those previous ones that hold huge amounts of wealth, actually. So when you talk about the Hrant Dink Foundation, it is that, the word used is Vacath, but it's a new foundation. And so it's sort of cut off from the politics of thinking all of the different Armenian and even non-Muslim Vacaths together, because it's not in the same category. So it's clear that there was some negotiation in order to, get them recognized at all, right? I think that it probably was not a given that this administrative category was going to stay possible for non-Muslims. If you look at all of the work that has been done, including by some folks here, on the confiscation of properties and things like this, a lot of these are Vacath properties that were lost. So probably people would have been very happy if these did not continue as an actual administrative category. So on the one hand, it's clear that there's some real intense negotiation happening, right? Because on the one hand, there's an impetus to sort of get rid of all these properties, to liquidate them, to centralize them, whatever. But on the other hand, there is this transformation of them where they all get settled into the community foundations and set apart as something a little bit different. Now, those details of that story, I don't really know. And certainly in the secondary literature that I was reading, in order to then bring us into the present in my dissertation, I did not find anything that really, especially from the minority perspective, looks at what those negotiations looked like. So I think that's an important place for research that could.
Yeah, that is.
Thanks.
So the question from Ümit back to Christine, I think she was reading it. So can you give us some information about the role of Refik Halit Karay, and how could you depict or portray his opposition to the new regime?
Yeah, that's a good one. I have 2 or 3 chapters on that in the book that's coming out. So how could I condense that into a few sentences? Basically, I'm going to start once the Republic was established. He had already fled the country and was in Syria/Lebanon. How can we characterize his opposition in the early moments? I should say he did seem to be vehemently opposed to the new regime, what he called like the new regime, until 1928, when he magically had a change of convictions. Funnily enough, timed with the consolidation of power in the Republic, where it wasn't even worth opposing it anymore. So then from 1928 until he was accepted back into the country in 1938, he basically had a campaign to ingratiate himself with the Kemalist authorities, and he managed to do it. And I talk about that in a whole chapter. But in that early Republican period, which is what we're supposed to be talking about here, he was dead set against the regime, partly as sort of the spillover of what you might call opportunism, or his liberal opposition to the nationalists, which he considered the CUP in disguise. And we see now in many ways he was right. And partly because he didn't think the nationalists would actually pull it off. Even after the victory, he didn't actually think that it was going to gel into a new independent state. Partly because he thought, well, they're unionists in disguise. They're Philistines as unionists, because he was from a very he saw himself as being from this cultivated Istanbul Francophile bureaucratic background. He also saw he knew all the personalities, so he also objected he opposed them on personal grounds because he felt that a lot of them were hypocrites, that a lot of them maybe had opposed the nationalists at an earlier stage and then turned when they thought that momentum was in their favor and jumped on the bandwagon. So he had a whole range of grievances, I guess, with the regime. And then I would classify him like in terms of the 1924-25 opposition party. He was sort of like in the landscape of muhalefet within Turkey in that early moment. I would see him as like an extreme on a continuum and on the extreme end of the Istanbul press, which most of them were opposition in those first few years. And that's partly why when the quashing of the Sheikh Said rebellion happened and the Takrir-i Sükun law was passed, they lumped the press in with that and created, martial law and extreme censorship because the Istanbul press was overall expressing dissent left and right toward Ankara. So I would see him, and his friends were, it was his friends from the Istanbul press that encouraged him to send them his memoirs from exile, because there had not yet been a law passed against publishing the works of people from the list of 150, which is what he was on. So he clearly still had friends in those circles. So he wasn't like friends with Kazım Karabekir or anything, but he was like, on the fringes of that Istanbul liberal press elite is how I would situate him. I don't know if that answers your questions, Ümit. I could talk a lot more about him, as you can see.
That's good, thank you. I had a question for Erdem, because Erdem, you talked about the general directorates, but I was wondering what exactly was the relationship between the directorates and the actual political administration in the sense of vilayets and governors. Did one have superior authority over the other, or did it depend on the period of time that you're talking about?
So generally, of course, there is some competition between Shakir Pasha and I would say Zeki Pasha during the Ottoman period, but he was assigned as kind of the head of all governors, actually. So it was, all those cities were combined and brought under his rule. And something similar is happening during the Kemalist period. Again, they discuss about their authority. So what is our power? What's our authority? But they generally, they're responsible to the president or to the presidency or to the sultan during the Ottoman periods, not directly to the interior ministry in that sense, like the governors, and they're above the governors. And also they have the power to control some aspects of the military in the region.
And so in 1914, when they had the reform, then when they were going to appoint Europeans, that was basically going to replace. That was a big problem.
Yeah. And they already appointed them, and actually they were there for a while. But that inspectorship, I think it's not significant because what it did, but it is significant because what it could do actually. Because it was, giving almost autonomy to Armenians. And I, again, don't want to make a direct connection between the genocide and also that inspectorship. But what you see is, the Unionists, they don't want to give up on that authority. And that's kind of a breaking point between the Unionists and the Armenian elites, because the Armenian elites, they don't, trust Unionists as well. They insist on the appointment of European inspectorship, if not themselves. And earlier, they couldn't convince Sultan Abdullah to do that because you see in the documents, he doesn't want to appoint a Christian inspectorate. But that happened in 1914. And, again, I don't want to make a direct connection, but I think it is a turning point. And I think we have one of the guests, Ohannes Kılıçdağı, maybe, I wish we could give him a chance to actually talk about that. But Robert Koptaş, he wrote actually a really good article on that, which you can, also look at it. It's specifically about, that reform plan in the 1914 and the discussion between the Armenian elites and the Unionists and how kind of it played role, what came after. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a question for Christopher from Armin Marsubian. It says you referred to the AKP coalition in your talk. Was there a coalition with other parties with the AKP? He wasn't aware of the coalition parties until maybe the MHP a little bit later in recent years. But when you referred to them, was there a coalition with other parties? Are you?
I think I might have referred to them as a coalition. Did you
Okay,
refer
yeah.
to them, Christopher, too?
I just talked about the early period of the AKP and how that sort of generated some of the academic interest in secularism.
So I guess the
Yes.
question was, were there other parties? Christine, maybe you can.
I would, yeah, when I say coalition, I didn't mean other formal parties, but I think that what we've seen since Gezi, and especially since the alleged coup attempt, we've seen the splintering of what must have been a coalition that made up that party. So what I meant is the breaking apart of like the Gulen movement and the let's say the non-Gulen portion of AKP, and there was a more varied social base for AKP in the early years, which has broken apart in the past 5 years. That's what I was talking about.
Right, and I think the other part of that, right, is that sort of the perception that the AKP was willing to do certain kinds of things and make certain kind of concessions that today maybe they're not willing to make. Right?
And there was an intellectual wing of the party, that's what I was trying to say too.
Right.
That like that's gone now, I think, for all intents and purposes. So yeah,
Well,
like a scholarly intellectual wing.
I'd like to thank our panelists for this evening's presentations. We're going to be continuing tomorrow morning, Saturday morning at 10 o'clock California time, Pacific time, with our second session, which will have 3 papers. The first by Dr. Talin Sujian, the second by Dr. Ümit Kurt, and the third by Dr. Ari Sheklian. So we will continue our conversation tomorrow. If you have questions, you can ask questions. And we brought up the panelists brought up some very interesting aspects and some new ways of thinking. And I think that's kind of where we were headed with this conference. So thank you, Dr. Philliou, Dr. Shuklian, Erdem, Ilter, for your presentations. And we'll see everybody tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barlow. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night,
Thanks.
everyone.
Good night.
Morning.
Bye.
Yeah. Yeah.